Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Georgine Chastain, and I'm the president of the Slovak American Society of Washington, D.C. And I'd like to welcome everyone to this afternoon's presentation titled, Where Wildlife and People Meet, Ecotourism and Nature Conservation in Slovakia, with Robin Rigg of the Slovak Wildlife Society. It's great to see such a great crowd at our virtual audience today. And for information on future SASW programs, members should watch their email or check our website at dcslovaks.org. If you're not currently a member of the Slovak American Society of Washington, D.C., even if you don't live in the Washington, D.C. area, you can still join our group and be notified of upcoming programs. I can put the URL for our website in the chat. And if you're interested in joining or have questions during the presentation, Marta, our vice president, can give you further information in the chat. I'd like to kindly request that everyone mute their microphones on their devices, and please keep them muted during the presentation. While our speaker is speaking, feel free to use the chat function to ask questions. And then after he's done speaking, we can go to the questions. We'll also open up the floor for more questions. As a reminder, this afternoon's presentation is being recorded, and it will be made available soon and on our Slovak American Society YouTube channel. Okay, about our presenter. From the majestic peaks of the Tatra Mountains to the expansive Danube Lowland, Slovakia has a rich and beautiful natural heritage. The country's small size belies its relatively high levels of biodiversity. Large carnivores survived here in the heart of crowded Europe, while they vanished from much of the rest of the continent. In recent years, the numbers of wolves, and especially brown bears, have increased substantially, presenting both challenges and opportunities. This talk explores the potential of ecotourism, from passive wildlife watching to active conservation volunteering, to help foster sustainable approaches to human-wildlife coexistence. Robin Rigg, our speaker today, is a dual Slovak-British national, specializing in wildlife conservation, research, management, and coexistence with local communities. He is chairman of the Slovak Wildlife Society and a member of the Large Carnivore Initiative for Europe. Robin has been hosting and guiding ecotourism experiences in Slovakia, including bear watching and wolf tracking, for 25 years. He has a bachelor's degree in natural, medical, and veterinary sciences from the University of Cambridge, UK, a master's in zoology from the University of Aberdeen, Scotland, and he is writing his PhD dissertation on wolves at the University of Ljubljana, Slovenia. And now I'd like to turn over the Zoom microphone to Robin.
Hello, afternoon, everybody. Well, good evening from Slovakia. I hope you can hear me. Okay, can you just confirm that you can?
Yep.
Thank you.
I can hear you fine.
Great. So now I'm going to attempt to start my presentation. So then if you could just let me know if you can see that.
Okay.
Do you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Just a second, so I get my notes up. I hope. Do you still see the presentation?
Yes.
In full screen?
Yes.
Wow. Okay, so let's start. So first of all, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for coming, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you today. First of all, I'd like to say that I chose this photograph on the first slide to illustrate the title of my talk, Where Wildlife and People Meet. So the photo shows a group of ecotourists that I was guiding, together with a few Slovak hikers who just happened to pass us by as we were in the Western Tatras near the Polish border. And if you're wondering where the wildlife is, it's there where everybody's looking. I've got to figure out how to change the slide. How do we do that? Just a minute, please.
Should be bottom left corner. There's like a little ghosted arrow.
Yeah, but it's because I have a split screen and my notes are on part of it. So. Okay. Sorry about this. I think once I've got this done once, then we'll be fine after that. Okay. Is there a little circle?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So where that circle is some wildlife, basically. And if I go to the next slide, or the next animation, so that's what we were looking at. That's a view through somebody's spotting scope, so it's a bit blurry. But basically there was a bear family there, so a mother European brown bear and 2 cubs. It's going to be slightly awkward because I have to kind of flip back and forth between my notes and the slides. Okay. So I'll get back to the bears later, but first of all, I'd like to tell you how I ended up in that situation. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm originally from the UK, and I grew up hill walking in Wales and Scotland, where the landscape looks like this. And that's on a sunny day, which it often isn't, actually. It's usually wet and raining, or at least it was back then. But the main feature to notice is that it's very open landscape. You know, there's some forest in the background, but a lot of it's just open hillside with grass and not too much else. And further up in the Highlands of Scotland, there's heather, which looks very nice when it's in flower. And in some areas you have bracken, but they're really open hillsides. Now, for me, that used to be normal. You know, I thought that was what Britain was supposed to look like. But I first came out to Slovakia for a summer camp in 1996, and I was just amazed by what I saw, because here it's completely different. You have hillsides covered in forest, right up to the top, and in fact higher than any hills or mountains reach in Britain, completely covered with forest, or largely covered with forest. And then there are also some beautiful meadows there. And I began to realize, Britain is actually not so natural as I've always thought. It's actually been really heavily changed by activities of people, and in fact over thousands of years. So I'm going back into prehistory. So I was really excited by what I saw in Slovakia. And I was even more excited because there were large predators living in those forests that we lost in Britain hundreds of years ago. So I spent 2 weeks in summertime helping to reconstruct some traditional wooden structures in the mountains to store hay after it's been cut. And that's me as a 24-year-old learning scything for the first time and doing it very badly, while all the Slovaks watch with amusement at how slow and bad I was at doing it. But anyway, it was a very nice time. But what I was really hoping for was to see some wolves. Well, that first trip came about by chance. I won't go into the details unless anyone wants to ask about it later, but there was a whole series of chance events with some unexpected things happening and some surprise meetings that eventually led to an invitation, which then led on to a 48-hour bus journey into the heart of Europe from Britain out to Slovakia. Now, I knew almost nothing about Slovakia, I must admit, at that time, except that it had been part of Czechoslovakia, which had been hidden for 40 years behind the Iron Curtain. And that also really intrigued me. I remember seeing on television sort of food queues in former Eastern Europe. And also we watched live as the falling of the Berlin Wall and the revolution that led to the end of communism in Central Eastern Europe. So I found that fascinating as well. And I really, fell in love with the place, and so much so that I offered to volunteer for longer. So it was 2 weeks initially, but then I went back for a year to help an environmental group that's based in Šariš, which is in the east of Slovakia. It's a very rural area. In fact, it's only 50 miles from the border with Ukraine, or from the former USSR. So it was all very exciting for me. So I went back, or came back, for a year. And I immersed myself in nature. And so I was volunteering for that conservation organization. Every weekend I spent going to the mountains, sleeping out, usually all through the winter, desperate to see wolves. And I hadn't seen any wolves during those first 2 weeks. So kept trying, kept failing, but it was just wonderful. The wildlife and the nature, even to track wolves in the snow or hear them howling, were things that I'd never had the chance to do before. And it was very exciting, a little bit scary when I was there by myself. Winters were proper winters back then, deep snow. One of the first nights I spent alone in the mountains, it was minus 25 degrees Celsius. And I was wading through snow up to my thighs. I could move about half a mile in an hour. So it was really tough conditions, but thrilling, really thrilling. But I came to know not everybody was thrilled at that time. And in fact, it was a tough time for many Slovak people. There'd been a revolution, as I said. So communism had ended. But a lot of people were struggling with the transition from a centrally planned socialist system to the kind of free-for-all capitalist approach. Now, there were agencies there trying to help, such as USAID and the Soros Open Society Foundations and so on, trying to help to build civil society. And there were also a lot of US Peace Corps volunteers in Slovakia at that time. I met a lot of them, but I noticed that many of them seemed a bit jaded and disillusioned, quite like Slovakia itself at that time. So a common thread that I heard while I was talking to them was that the host organization had taken the opportunity to receive a volunteer because it was offered to them. But when the volunteer arrived, the hosts didn't really seem to know what they wanted them to do. The country had gone through the revolution, the Velvet Revolution, so more or less peaceful protests, and then the overthrow of the Communist Party rule, and then the Velvet Divorce, so the separation from the Czechs in 1993 was also peaceful, or even more peaceful. But when I arrived, so 1996, a few years later, the country seemed to have got stuck in a rut with quite an authoritarian government. So the remnants of the socialist past were crumbling. The photo there, those are they've actually been painted there, so they look a bit nicer than they did in the 90s, but those were some concrete tower blocks on the edge of Bratislava, if you're familiar. It's just part of the Petržalka housing area. So those were kind of falling into disrepair, but there was very little new investment. So the economy was doing badly, and people were really disappointed with how things were going. So the question that I was asked over and over again by almost everyone that I met was, why have you come here? You know, we want to leave. we want to go to the west. Why have you come here? So what I always said to them was that I loved the nature and the landscape and the wildlife. And when I said that, they usually agree and say, yeah, those are beautiful. And quite often, they would also mention that the Slovak women were beautiful as well. I hope this is not going to come across as politically incorrect these days, but there is a reason for this photo. So first of all, what I've just said is true. It seemed that during those times that the only two positives that most of the people I met could think of about their own country was nature and pretty women. But I was going to mention that the lady in the middle there is Andrea Varoshova, who won Miss Slovakia in 1999. So that's her being crowned as Miss Slovakia. And she went on to have a career in modeling. But the girl on the left, called Adela, who was the runner-up, she, as part of her prize, won a language course at the Berlitz Language School in Košice in eastern Slovakia, which is where I was working at the time, because I was still there, now more than 3 years since I first went out to Slovakia. So I got to teach her English for a while. But yeah, those were quite gloomy times in Slovakia, at least amongst the people anyway. Much better out in the nature. But despite that negativity, those years in Slovakia still weren't enough for me. So I stayed on for another and another, and then many more. And I've been living out here ever since, basically, which is now more than half my life. Most of that spent in the Liptov region, which this photo is taken in. And that's where I am right now. And this is where I finally got to see some wild wolves after 4 years of trying. So it took a while. Actually, that village you can see there is not the village that I live in. My village is even smaller than that. It's that little one there. And actually, it's called Benusholte. And it's officially the smallest settlement in Liptov. So really tiny, just nestled down in the bottom of the dale there. And as you can see, it's not very far away from forest and mountains, and indeed we have a lot of wildlife around here. You just need to cross 2 fields to get to where the bears are, or sometimes not even that far. But certainly at this time of year, there are often bears feeding on berries and apples at the roadside, as you can see, hopefully, in those photos there. So, anyway, fortunately, that period of pessimism that seemed to prevail in the 1990s didn't last. A change of government got the country back on track to join the European Union. And that's really been transformational for Slovakia. It's had huge benefits, I would say. Economic reforms led to GDP growing at one of the highest rates in the EU in the period from 2002 to 2007. And for that period of time, the Slovak economy was known as the Tatra Tiger. Now, again, sorry, I'm just toddling back and forth between my notes and changing the slides. So bear with me, please. So membership of the EU also brought Slovakia to the attention not only of foreign investors, but also tourists from outside the region. So in those first few years I was here, most of the visitors, as far as I noticed, were from neighboring states, very few people from Western Europe. but membership of the EU, as I say, raised the profile of the country, and people from Western Europe sort of gradually came to hear about it and came to have a look in some cases. Now, to be honest, from my point of view, I quite liked the fact that Slovakia was less well known than many of the other countries in Europe. But it was obvious, the country had considerable untapped potential as a tourist destination. And it was also pretty clear to me that there was very little ecotourism going on. I'll come back to that later in terms of defining what ecotourism actually means. But there were, I saw as I was walking through the landscape, a lot of towers, wooden towers like this. It was a quite elaborate one, sort of with multiple stories. Some are much more simple than that. And I thought they were hides for bird watching or wildlife watching when I first saw them. And so I was amazed that the country was so enthusiastic about watching wildlife. Maybe some of you know better than that. You're already chuckling, but as it turns out, these are not for watching wildlife, but for shooting it. So these are hunters' hides, high seat for shooting wildlife. So there's plenty of that going on, but not so much just going out to watch wildlife, or certainly not amongst the general public. So there was lots of potential and lots of wildlife. Again, toddling back and forth. So Slovakia is a pretty small country. Now, my apologies if everybody knows this already, but I'll just mention it's only around 49,000 square kilometers, just under 19,000 square miles, which is smaller than West Virginia. I was looking for a US state for comparison. So smaller than West Virginia, but with 3 times more people living there. And yet it has a relatively, or really quite a high level of biodiversity. So the habitats are very varied, from the Danube and other river floodplains and lowlands in the south, some of which are only around 94 meters above sea level, which is about 300 feet, I think, right up to the high Tatras, that reach 2,655 meters, or more than 8,700 feet above sea level, on the top of Gerlach, which is the highest peak in Slovakia, and in fact is the highest peak in the Carpathians, and it's the highest peak anywhere between the Alps and the Caucasus Mountains. So the Tatras are part of the Carpathian Mountains, which extend from Czech Republic, a little tiny bit in Austria, through Slovakia, southern Poland, northern Hungary, into Ukraine, and then on into Romania. And they're home to many rare and endemic species of flora and fauna, as well as being an important staging post and a stopping off point for migrating birds, such as cranes. Slovakia currently has 9 national parks. The oldest and largest is Tatras National Park, which was established 75 years ago. So back in right at the beginning of the socialist period. The current area of the park is 738 square kilometers, or about 285 square miles, which is, again, just for a comparison, I looked this up, slightly smaller than Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. And it's home to about 1,300 species of plants, around 40 of which are endemic. There are also 170 species of vertebrates, including wolves. That's where I finally saw them, in the Tatras National Park. bears that I've already mentioned, Eurasian lynx, and also, endemic Tatra chamois, which is a subspecies unique to the area. And glacial action during the last ice age, glacial period, created some really striking landscape features, and more than 100 lakes in the park. So it's really beautiful landscapes and lots of wildlife. And some very wild areas, fragments of primeval forest. There's also some tourism. In fact, in 2019, the Lonely Planet travel guide proclaimed the High Tatras as the most significant summer destination in Europe. So it was in their top 10 summer destinations for Europe that year. And in their description, they said, "Snow willow blankets the ground, and fearsome beasts patrol the forests." Fearsome beasts. Actually, tourism, of course, started a long time before 2019 and the Lonely Planet, and indeed a long time before the socialist period that I've already mentioned. Began centuries ago. The first explorers, we might call them, sort of precursors of tourists, were thought to be, or are mentioned as being, back in the 16th century, a lady called Beata Laska from the castle in Kizmar is mentioned. And then the first ascent of one of the Tatra Mountains was by mathematician and astronomer David Fröhlich, who probably climbed Kezmarski Steep. Took him 3 days, had a very exciting time. And then later on, first settlements started to be established. Can I just check in that you can hear me? Okay, by the way.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, it's all right. Okay. Be ashamed.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah. Just so that we don't find out after 45 minutes I've been talking to myself.
Well, it's okay, Robin. We'll flag you down if we can hear you.
It's always a worry on Zoom that, is anybody there?
Yeah, I know. We all went mute and pictures off. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's fine.
I wish I would be in Slovakia, but sorry, I'm in Virginia.
That's okay. Oh, Virginia. I
Yeah.
picked a good example then.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so back to the story. So the first tourism resort, as we might call it now, was established in 1793, and this was Stary Smokovec in the High Tatras. And it was actually created around spring. So this sort of slightly more organized early tourism was based around spas or springs. And the photo that I have on the screen at the moment that actually shows the original spa or spring. And then the more historical picture in the bottom left is a postcard from, I think that was from 1929, possibly, if I remember right. Yeah. But in those, and also, skipping forward to the next slide. This was just while I was reading around the topic, came across something quite fun. So, also connected with a spa, which is why I've included it here. So during mining operations in 1926, an unusual oval stone was discovered. You have a picture of it there, which turned out to be, and the people who found it didn't realize immediately, but it was worked out later, that this was the cast of the brain cavity of a Neanderthal who lived near the spring about 120,000 years ago. So it might not have been a tourist, it may have been a resident rather than a tourist, but he was still near the spring. And in fact, it's possible he may have died intoxicated by poisonous gases escaping from the spring, possibly. But the site of that has now been, or is being developed as a geothermal archaeology park, so it's a tourism site. You can even get some Neanderthal pizza. So anyway, I just mentioned that for fun. Now, this early tourism, even through into the 19th century, was still on a very small scale, partly because people had different priorities back then, but also because of the difficulty of access. To get to the mountains, you had to go on foot, or maybe horse-drawn carriages in some cases. So there weren't that many tourists. But the construction of the railway made a huge difference. The railway between Košice in Slovakia and Bohumín in what's now Czech Republic, so in 1871. And this allowed far more people to travel into the area. And over the course of the next 20 years, 15 settlements sprang up around the southern foothills of the Tatras, which are basically the core of the tourist infrastructure till today. So I mentioned Stary Smokovec was the older one. It was joined by Štrbské Pleso, Tatranská Lomnica, and gradually others too. So this brought mass tourism to the Tatras, and by the beginning of the 20th century, they were a popular tourist destination and recreation area. I was reading that the first car came to the Tatras in 1900 along the Freedom Road, and 12 years later, the first bus. So people really started arriving in considerably bigger numbers. And that's a trend that's only accelerated since then. As you can see on this next slide, this is another sort of milestone along the way. So this photograph was taken in 1970, when there was a ski world championship held at Štrbské Pleso, so in the High Tatras, with various ski disciplines, and a lot of infrastructure was built for that. So ski jumps and cross-country ski tracks and accommodation blocks and everything else. And it's estimated that in February 1970, nearly 150,000 people were present to see that, which was then the most modern ski area in Central Europe. So new roads were built, parking areas, hotels, buffets, attractions, and all sorts, many of which are still there till today, and more have joined them. So we're now really in the era of mass tourism, as you can see, focused on sport in this case, but a lot of people. Now, the next event I want to mention is 2004. Again, some of you may know this, but on the evening of Friday, November 19th, 2004, during a very short period of time, just an hour or two, winds of almost 200 kilometers per hour, or about 120 miles per hour, uprooted or broke trees across an area of about 12,000 hectares, which is around 46 square miles. So affecting a total volume of about 2.5 million cubic meters of wood. The southern slopes of the Tatras were the most affected, and there was basically a band of forest that was either blown over or snapped, exposing many of those recreation areas that until then had been nestled within the forest. And the country was in shock. The president came to see it, many politicians, members of parliament. It was quite a shocking event. But very quickly, some politicians and developers started to see an opportunity. So, forest is gone. Well, now we can build lots more hotels on it. And indeed, in many cases, that's partly at least what happened. Now, it probably goes without saying that this kind of pace of development can't go on indefinitely. I mean, it's just by definition unsustainable. You can't keep having more and more people and more hotels. At some point, the resources are going to run out. There's no more space. So, in connection with that, Slovakia, as a signatory to the Carpathian Convention, which has been signed, ratified by all the Carpathian countries, adopted a protocol on sustainable tourism in 2011. Now, in that document, there's quite a lengthy definition of what sustainable tourism is. You have on the screen there. I'll just read out the beginning part of it that relates more to wildlife, nature. So they've defined sustainable tourism as tourism which provides for sustainable use of environmental resources, prevents threats to the biological and landscape diversity on which it is intrinsically dependent. So you need some wildlife and nature in order to be able to go and see wildlife and nature.
Excuse me, Robin, we're looking at your notes.
Oh, that's kind of strange. What about now?
Still the notes.
And now?
Notes.
I'm sorry. I think the slide just has
Yeah,
the
I think
definition
this
on
is-
it.
Yeah.
What
Okay.
is
Yeah, he was fine.
Yeah, I think this is the slide you were supposed to see, the sustainable tourism.
Yeah, does it have a kind of green band along the top?
Yes.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's part of the slide. Okay.
Oh, okay. So
part of the
sorry.
slide. No, that's
Yeah.
right. So that's this long definition that I mentioned that's in the article. Yeah, so I'm just reading the first couple of lines. So,
Okay.
so main point: sustainable tourism shouldn't, in order to be sustainable, it shouldn't destroy the thing that people are going to see. Right? That's if I can summarize it like that. So sustainable tourism ought to be minimizing adverse environmental, ecological, cultural, and social impacts. So Slovakia signed up to that, as did all the other, say, signatories to the Carpathian Convention. But are those just words on paper? You know, do they really mean it? Or is that just so much blah, blah, blah? Well, certainly there are some cases in which development has continued to be blatantly unsustainable, in the sense that things can't possibly go on like this indefinitely. So I just put one example here. This is the Jasna ski resort. I mean, now it's more than a ski resort, so resort, year round resort in the Low Tatras. So this is in the middle of one of Slovakia's other national parks, and every year they seem to add more and bigger hotels and more and bigger chairlifts and ski lifts. And indeed, in this case, even local people have been protesting about this. So activists and conservationists, environmentalists, but even local people saying, this is just too much. It's destroying the character of the area. There's concern about how much water is needed to maintain all of these people in this area. And on that theme, this is not from Slovakia, but from elsewhere in Europe. So this year, I don't know if you're aware, if you've noticed, but there have been protests in several areas. This one is from Barcelona in Spain, of local people telling tourists to go home, that they're not welcome. People just feel like it's just too much, just too many tourists, having all sorts of impacts, pushing up the costs of housing in the area, so local people can't afford to live there anymore, as well as the overcrowding and the infrastructure development. So there's starting to be some rejection of mass tourism, not just by environmentalists, but by local people in some parts of Europe and perhaps beyond too. Now, tourism does have some quite major problems. And as implied by that definition on sustainable tourism, a lot of tourism isn't sustainable, and it's having some major effects on the environment, including a contribution to global warming. So there's this study here it's published in 2018, but they found actually much earlier than that, so the years of study 2009 to 2013, that the carbon footprint of tourism had increased quite considerably, and it was estimated to account for about 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So having quite major effects. Now, maybe the text isn't very legible on that one, but this is showing that during the pandemic and the lockdowns that we all went through, or most of us went through, and restrictions on activity, general economic global slowdown, global carbon emissions dropped by 7% in 2020, which was a record. So there were some hopes at that time that maybe, despite all the negatives of the COVID-19 pandemic, there might be a positive would come out of it in a new relationship with our environment. But no, unfortunately, that was very short-lived. It was a temporary blip, basically, and the level of greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere never came down. They just went up slightly slower for a short time, and now they're racing away again. And indeed, after possibly partly because we were stuck at home a lot, now people are sort of rushing around, desperate to travel and go and see places that they couldn't, and tourism is again booming, with even greater concerns about its impact on environment than before in some cases. And climate change doesn't just mean global warming. The average global temperature is rising. That's beyond doubt. And it's beyond doubt that it's largely caused by human activities. But it also has a number of other aspects to it as well. So as well as the overall warming, there are more extreme weather events. And we've seen some of that recently. And in fact, just right now, this weekend, we've, in the course of a few days in Slovakia and neighboring states, we've gone from basically drought conditions of extremely high temperatures, highly unusual for September, to a drop of 10 degrees Celsius, storms and floods. And this is going to happen more and more often. I'm afraid to say the situation's even worse than that, because climate change is only one part of what the United Nations recognizes as the triple crisis that we're in now. So the other two elements being massive biodiversity loss across the planet and pollution, emissions, plastics, and so on. So the WWF, World Wildlife Fund, or Worldwide Fund for Nature, is drawing attention to a triple challenge that humanity now faces in the coming decades. How can we meet the needs of the world's large and growing human population while tackling the climate crisis and trying to stop, but ideally reverse the loss of nature? It's going to be tough. So, what can we do? Maybe those last few slides are a bit gloomy, but as a trained scientist, I deal with facts, and those are the facts, I'm afraid. But yeah, what can we do? Can we do something? Well, governments, to a greater or lesser extent, are looking into what could be done. Some of them are even doing things already. So coming out of the pandemic, Slovakia and many other member states of the European Union developed recovery plans. So coming out of the pandemic, but these also took into account, these crises of the environment that I just mentioned. So as you can see there, the various targets include focus on climate, transitioning to greener, more sustainable futures, and so on. And really large amounts of money were being pledged towards that. But of course, as we know, governments in democratic countries get changed every now and again. And sometimes new governments can have very different ideas from old governments. So we've seen that in Slovakia recently too. So the government that was in power while that plan was being developed with the European Union and had been very progressive in terms of environmental protections, is now lost the last election, lost the election last year, and the new government clearly has a very different approach. So they've been backpedaling in a lot of the environmental protections and pledges. But looking into the future, things could go many different ways, and indeed that was the point of this analysis that I came across that you can find on the internet if you're interested in more detail. So, Nature Outlook to 2050, which investigated various scenarios for nature in Slovakia and implications for public policy. So the authors examined 4 possible scenarios, other than just carrying on with the status quo. So in scenario number 1, they envisioned a focus on traditions, promoting traditional values and developing local potential. Scenario 2 was emphasizing biodiversity more, defining an extensive network of natural areas and protecting them very strictly, but then at the risk of unsustainable development outside those areas. In scenario 3, the economy was more based on private initiatives and maximizing the potential profits from nature, basically, so more exploitation. So this might bring revitalization of the landscape in some areas and more emphasis on protection of local natural resources, but with the risk of disproportionate pressure on nature in other areas being very significant. And then scenario 4, which they called innovations. This was more building on the concept of ecosystem services. So, we don't know which of those scenarios will come about. Each of them has their advocates. It may well depend, which governments we get. So, what can we do as individuals? Well, as I say,
what is this doing?
I may have got you into a bit of a gloomy mood, but can we get out of that gloomy mood like Slovakia managed to do in the 1990s? Is there a way that we can get ourselves out of this without waiting for government? Well, yeah, there's a lot of things that we can do as individuals, as small groups, as non-governmental organizations. And now, compared to what governments can do or businesses, these might seem like small steps, but we should keep in mind that even, as the Chinese proverb says, even a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So what can we do? Well, earlier on, I mentioned trains being part of the problem, in a sense, in the 19th century of opening up areas to mass tourism. But now, compared to flying, trains and other forms of public transport can be part of the solution, because they have far lower carbon emissions than airplanes do. So I've just included this slide to try to lighten the mood a little bit. So this is from a holiday with my son that we went on last year, taking the overnight train from Bratislava to Croatia, to the Croatian coast. So you can get on the train in Bratislava, go to sleep, and wake up in Split by the sea in Croatia, which is right on the coast. So then you can take a boat out to one of the islands. And it was wonderful. It was really, really nice. And going on the train was part of the experience. Later on that same year, so last year, I took another overnight train from Slovakia to Romania. But that time, I had to get a connecting train down to Budapest, and then took the night train from Budapest to Brașov in Romania. And again, fantastic. It's an adventure. And later on this year, I'm really excited. I'm going to be going to the UK for the first time by train from Slovakia. So I'll go to Vienna and then take a night train up to Brussels, and then the Eurostar train through the Channel Tunnel. So in my early years, I used to travel between Britain and the UK by bus, which was a bit of a tortuous journey. But I'm really excited about taking the train. Now, of course, overland travel is a lot slower than flying, usually. And unfortunately, because of the way taxes and economies and pricings work, it tends to be more expensive. But if you can embrace that and embrace the concept of slow travel and make it part of the trip, so the journey itself becomes part of the adventure, then it really is a good way to go. And now, I'm not saying that we should all do this all of the time. That might not be practical, but we could do it at least some of the time. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing. Another very environmentally, well, even more environmentally friendly mode of transport is by bike. Now, this can be a form of tourism too, or also a leisure activity, with health benefits, fitness, and so on. Some people, if they're able to, commute to work by bike. And Slovakia has been putting quite a lot of money into the development of cycle routes. And they are, as I say, very environmentally friendly. The bicycle itself obviously doesn't have any emissions. I mean, there are some emissions in making bikes. But once you have one, you're not creating any pollution. And the infrastructure is much less impactful than roads, airports, railway stations, and so on. And you can be really amongst the nature. So in this particular slide here, I'm showing you the main photo shows a cycle route below the High Tatras. So there's part of the High Tatras in the background, my two sons in the foreground. So we're cycling along what was a forestry road, and now it's been adapted as a cycle route. And on a section that was just 3.5 kilometers long, so just a couple of miles long, we found 54 scats or species of wolves. So wolves are using this area very intensively or frequently throughout the year. Some of them were older, some were fresh, some are bigger, some are smaller. So obviously multiple wolves over an extended period of time, which again was really quite exciting. And then coming back to bears, as I promised you in the beginning that I would. So bears also sometimes use cycle routes. And maybe you can see in the red circle, that is actually a bear on a cycle path. But in this particular case, or this type of situation, then not everybody is as excited as I am. Some people are scared. And in fact, bears in Slovakia have become quite a big issue, and even becoming part of the election campaigns for some political parties last year. So those of you who don't know Slovak, this billboard says, "The bear is not more than a human." And this was a billboard by the Slovak National Party for the elections last year, and they are now part of the coalition government. Now I came, again, when I was researching for this talk, I read on the internet an article or an analysis here by, I think, an economist or political commentator who compared, or who wrote this Slovakia tiger versus bear, referring to the Tatra tiger economy, as I mentioned earlier, and these bear issues, and basically making the point that both of these have become elements of political campaigning, and sort of implying that the bear thing is more a populist, not a serious issue, and the economy is really an important issue. I think that's a little bit of an oversimplification. Actually, the number of bears in Slovakia, the population has increased quite a bit. So, there has been a change. So bears had been strongly suppressed by persecution and intensive hunting in Slovakia, as in many other places, in the 19th and early 20th century. And they were almost eradicated by the 1930s. There were just a few tens of bears left in Slovakia at that time. But luckily, if you like bears and wildlife, people recognized that if they carried on with that level of hunting, there wouldn't be any bears left. So they were protected for a period of about 30 years or so. And that allowed them to start to recover, slowly at first, because there weren't very many left. But they did begin to recover. And then during this next period of time, the population, if I go back a step, population began to grow a little bit more quickly. So some limited hunting of bears was reintroduced or renewed. So that's what those columns show. The numbers on the left are approximate numbers of bears in the population, and the numbers on the right are the numbers that were killed by hunters each year. But as you can see, even after the hunting was begun again, the population continued to grow and has continued to grow, and has become the subject of a lot of discussion, let's say, public debate, political campaigning, as I've already mentioned. So what people are, or many people are particularly worried about, is meeting a bear, and especially the risk or the possibility that it might get attacked by one. And people can see that there are more bears than there used to be. They're more visible, they're clearly around, people are meeting them more often. And actually the number of cases of maulings has increased. And we had a first case of a fatal mauling in 2021, first case in a century. And this year, actually, one woman died, actually not killed directly by a bear, but she encountered a bear, and while she was running away, she fell and died as a result of her injuries from falling. So I wouldn't entirely dismiss it as just a populist thing for a billboard. There is an issue. People are concerned. Which brings me on to my work, really, and what I've been doing in Slovakia. So I'm now a citizen, I have dual citizenship, I've lived here a long time, but certainly in the first few years, I felt that my status as someone who'd come in from elsewhere meant that I shouldn't be going around telling people what to do. But I would be more appropriate if I tried to find a way that I could help people as well as wildlife. So that's really been my kind of the approach that I've tried to take ever since I've been here. So a group of us set up a little not-for-profit called the Slovak Wildlife Society, and started implementing various projects to help people cope with the presence of bears and also wolves. So things like helping farmers protect their sheep from wolves and bears. I noticed actually in the list of talks that you previously had, there was one about the Slovenski Chuvach livestock guarding dog, the Bringing Back Bodrick talk. So that was about work that I was involved in 20 years ago. And then also helping beekeepers to set up electric fences, coming up with designs for bear-proof garbage bins. Many of these ideas is not stuff that we thought of ourselves, but we looked to see what people are doing elsewhere in places like Yellowstone, Canada, and so on. What's worked in other places? What could we use here? And then also a lot of awareness raising, education with children and adults as well. And then another of the activities, coming back again to the topic of today's talk, is ecotourism, wildlife-focused ecotourism. So it's been pointed out, including in this study that I've mentioned there, Why So Negative, that although the intention of offering farmers and local people help through electric fencing and bear spray and learning how to avoid meeting with bears and so on, is all done with the best of intentions, to help people and to help wildlife. There's a risk that if we constantly focus on that, everything becomes all very negative, and people just always have in mind, well, bears are bad because they do this, or wolves are a pest because they, kill livestock. And we're in danger of forgetting the benefits, the positive aspects of having wildlife. Now, besides the intrinsic value of wildlife, it has a right to exist, whether or not we find some use for it. Also, these animals have roles in ecosystems, and apex predators, large carnivores like bears and wolves in particular, have key roles in many ecosystems, and so they have an indirect benefit through providing ecosystem services from intact or functioning, let's say, ecosystems. But it goes beyond that. There can even be an economic, socio-economic benefit in having an income. And an obvious way that this could come about is through ecotourism. Now, earlier I showed you that very long definition of sustainable tourism. You thought I was showing you my notes for that incorporating convention protocol. But this is a much shorter definition of what is ecotourism. So ecotourism has been defined as responsible travel to natural areas that conserves the environment, sustains the well-being of the local people, and involves interpretation and education. So you're not just sort of looking at stuff, you're also learning about it. And it has some benefit. So it even goes a bit beyond the sort of neutral, not doing harm, but there is a benefit. So that's another activity that I thought I could be involved in and have been involved in for most of the time I've been in Slovakia. So I say, when we set up Slovak Wildlife Society, one of the things that we started doing early on, sort of the end of the 20th century, and are still doing today, is offering carnivore-themed wildlife trips. In the early days, we didn't tend to see many carnivores. It was more taking people out to areas where these animals lived and looking for tracks and signs of their presence. But these days, we've learned a lot about how to do it. And also, I think, to be honest, because there are substantially more bears than there used to be, the opportunities to see them are statistically higher. So there are some areas where, if you know where to go, and you go there at the right time of year, and now is an excellent time actually, then there is a very good chance of seeing bears in particular. Now, wolves, still hard. In the forested environments we have here, wolves and lynx are very difficult to see, unless you're get very lucky or you're prepared to put in a lot of time. But with bears, if you know what they're eating, when and where, you have a good chance of seeing them. So there's that. But then we can even go beyond that, I think. So that's kind of, passive wildlife watching with a guide that does no harm and has some benefit for local people in terms of staying in locally owned accommodation, eating in local restaurants and so on. But can we go even beyond that so that visitors, tourists are actively doing something to contribute to conservation? Yes, we can. So one example of this is another project that we've been running now since the year 2010, focused on wolves. It's called Carpathian Wolf Watch. So the main focus of, or kind of the point of this project was to address disagreement between hunters, farmers, and environmentalists about how many wolves there are in Slovakia. So when we started, some environmental groups were saying that the wolf hunting season, as there was then, there was wolf hunting. So environmentalists were saying, this is devastating the wolf population. There's only 150 wolves left after the hunters have finished shooting them. Whereas the hunters were saying, that's not true. We reckon there are 10 times that many. And farmers were saying, oh, yeah, we agree with the hunters. So I'm kind of paraphrasing, obviously, but that's the gist of it. So the point of our project was to say, okay, rather than just arguing back and forth, can we use some actual science to try to find out what's really going on? So every winter in January and February, we do field work with trained volunteers, tracking in the snow wolves. Now, you can get already some information from that, counting tracks in the snow, but the really core part of the project, the key thing, is to collect samples of biological material. You can imagine what that might be. I've shown you some already, from which we can get DNA. And the DNA allows us to identify which individual the sample came from. And then if we have enough samples, we can estimate how many wolves there are in the area, objectively and reliably. So, and yeah, so say we've been doing that since 2010. We need volunteers every year. So I want to mention that right now we're recruiting volunteers for winter that's coming up, winter 2025. 3 weeks are available from 18th of January to the 7th of February. You don't have to join for all 3 weeks, and you can just join for 1 or 2 or 3. It's up to you. The first couple of days of each week are training, so explaining to you exactly what we want you to do, and then the volunteers go out in small groups. So you're not going out on your own. You're in a small group, most often 3 people, along a route, looking for tracks and collecting however many samples you can along the way. And if anyone's interested in that, this is my final slide, by the way. So I've included some contact details on the slide there for our organization in general. There's an email address there that you can write to, look at the websites. We have 2 websites. They're both very old-fashioned, I'm afraid, but one of them is for the organization, and then the other one is more focused on bears, Medvedieska, if you're interested in that. And then if anybody's thinking, that looks great, but I don't want to travel unsustainably, so instead you could support us through our GoFundMe campaign. So that's the end of my talk, so I'll hand back to the organizers, but if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Okay, thank you, Robin. If you could stop sharing, then we can see everybody. Excellent. And I don't see any questions in the chat. Okay, there is one.
There was one, yeah.
Yeah, and your slide with the graph, somebody said, what is the y-axis and population total? I guess that's the one with the wolves.
Yeah, I was wondering about, sorry, I can just explain it. It was
Okay.
like I think the maximum was like 1,500, which seemed like really low to me. So I was wondering if that was like the total.
So this is for bears, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, I think based on available evidence, I'd say there are around 2,000 bears in Slovakia. Now, bear in mind, it's a relatively small country and the population isn't spread across the whole country. So that equates to about 10 or more bears per 100 square kilometers on average, which is actually quite high density for bears. For brown bears, these are brown bears. Maybe you're thinking of black bears. These are brown bears. So the same species as grizzlies, but European. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Kara has her hand raised. If you want to just unmute and ask your question, Kara.
Yeah, sure. I have, yeah, I guess this is just my first question, but when you got into like the way that tourists can actually be providing a tangible benefit, it sounds like it's very much scientific monitoring is what you're talking about, citizen science, they're coming over, they're taking a look at wolves. Do you do any like physical labor? So I'm just thinking like when you're talking about where all those trees fell down during that windstorm, like planting trees or something like that, or are you really just focused on the citizen science side of things? Or you or other organizations, I should say.
Yeah, I mean, there are other organizations in Slovakia focused on conservation, some of whom use volunteers, some of whom recruit their volunteers, from outside Slovakia. So I mentioned our work because I wanted to promote it, but that's not to say that that's the only thing that's going on.
Okay, Suzanne, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, I'm Sue from Northern Virginia, and I have more comments rather than questions. First of all, wonderful presentation, and I commend you for the work you're doing. This has to be a global initiative, and I've been a wildlife fan since I was a little kid, and I'm part of a creation care group at my church. And one question that you raised was, what can we all do at this moment in time to help? And aside from some of the things you mentioned, which I'm sure all of us here are doing, you pointed out that there was a big change in what's happening in Slovakia after last year's election. And in the US, we have an election coming up in a matter of weeks, and the two candidates couldn't be further apart in their views on global warming and what can be done. And so I'm hoping people will look in their hearts and consider that as one of the issues when they go to the polls, because, it could be dreadful if the wrong person is elected. So sorry to get on my soapbox, but that's what we can do. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, and Christina, you have your hand raised, so just unmute and ask your question.
Hello, thank you very much for an interesting talk. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, good. I was just wondering, I lived in Slovakia for 10 years, but I left in 2012, so I don't know how things are going there with respect to what I'm about to ask. When I came to America, especially in the last several years, I've become very involved in local environmental issues, and I've become very kind of shocked at the very low level of environmental awareness in the United States. There's a lot of talk, but people don't really seem to think that their actions really have an effect. They always find some kind of excuses, like why their plane travel doesn't really matter because after all, they're private jets, or after all, China emissions are much greater, or India, or, there are always some kind of excuses. So I was just wondering, in your environmental activities there, how would you gauge the Slovaks' kind of environmental consciousness now? Is it I hope something maybe more similar to in Germany, where I think it's really quite high, or is it lower than you would like? And thanks a lot for the talk.
Thank you. Well, several different factors occur to me. If I go back to, so when I first came over in the 90s, amongst the many things that were strikingly different here for me, you know, through my eyes compared to what I was used to from Britain, was how people would use a lot less stuff. So the family that I lived with in the first year, they would wash out their plastic carrier bags from the shop, you know, and reuse them again and again and again. Drinks were bought in plastic bottles that would get taken back and reused. There was a deposit scheme and so on. There was a lot less rubbish. There's just a lot less stuff being used. That's not to say that everything was perfect. And there was some of the factories built during socialism were horrendously polluting, and I've mentioned the bottleneck that the bear population went through, and it wasn't just bears. You know, so I'm not saying everything was great, but in terms of sort of general consumerism, there was a lot less waste by average people in the 90s. Now, what since I've been here, and the kind of negative side of joining the EU and becoming a capitalist market economy, is the consumption has just gone. It's enormous. It's just people buying massive amounts of stuff and throwing massive amounts of stuff away. Now, some things are kind of going almost full circle now, in that, so the last few years, particularly the previous government that's now no longer the government, you know, they kind of tried to go back, in a sense, to recycling things, you know, that had either been in place before or weren't so necessary before, but now with people buying and using and throwing away so much stuff is really needed. So there's awareness of that, you know, but in a different way from previously. So that's one thing that I'd say. Then another thing that really struck me when I first came over, so I kind of mentioned that I thought all these hunting towers were for bird watching. It seems really silly. But yeah, I noticed when I first came over that very few regular people would go out looking at wildlife. You know, whereas in Britain, bird watching societies and other nature groups have millions of members. You know, it's hugely popular. Whereas here it was very utilitarian. So people would go out and pick mushrooms, and most people would have an idea of which mushrooms are edible, whereas your average English person would have no clue. And they'd also pick different herbs to make teas and berries and whatever, but not just. And a lot of that is done outdoors, and there's a lot of hiking and a lot of other outdoor activities, skiing and so on, but not so much just enjoying wildlife for wildlife's sake. But I think the last few years that's also started to change. And certainly in the past, most people who weren't involved in hunting or forestry thought that wildlife was hunters' business, and they didn't think too much about it. But now I see a lot more members of the public taking an interest in the state of wildlife. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, next is Kara again with another question.
Yeah. Sorry, I said I might have a couple. And sorry, I didn't really introduce myself. I'm Kara. I live on the opposite side of the country in Oregon, and I work for Oregon State University Extension. So that actually leads into my question here. So, I mean, how to move the Overton window is really quite large in my professional life as well. And I mostly work with landowners themselves and how they manage their land. So I guess my question is, like, coming from a place of ignorance on land ownership patterns in Slovakia, about like the level of public land ownership versus private land ownership and what can be done. Like, are there private landowners who do work on their own property who have maybe gotten bitten by the environmentalist bug, so to speak, and can be used even as an opportunity in partnership to like exemplify this, to other people, to help get what I like to call like this horizontal learning from landowner to landowner of, hey, look, this is what's going on their property. They're doing a real good job, and here's the benefits, and this is something that you could do on your property too.
Yeah, okay. So again, a couple of different things occur to me. So the environmental group that I volunteered for initially when I came over, as I mentioned, so they, while I was volunteering for them, bought an area of forest, and eventually it was quite a tortuous process because it hadn't been done before, but they managed to get it declared as a private nature reserve. So, I mean, it was just a bit of forest within a much larger forest. But that was quite a landmark moment. And they've gone on to establish another couple. And then there's other groups that are doing work in wetlands and so on. So, and it has expanded a little bit. So that's one thing. When I came to Liptov, one of the things that really struck me, and even more so since we've been doing this wolf monitoring, because you've got relatively high mountains under snow, well, for the time being, during the wintertime. So a lot of the wildlife moves down into the lower areas in the summer, and therefore out of the park, in the winter, sorry, moves down in the winter, and therefore out of the park onto private land. And in many cases, it's not necessarily one individual, but something called an urbar, which is like a kind of land management company. So they usually have some forest, they might have some agricultural interests and hunting rights and so on. Yeah, so in this area, a lot of the land in the lower areas outside the park where the wildlife goes to overwinter is in the hands of those companies. So a few years back, I had some discussions with people from the Banff area who were getting into, is it conservancies that they're called? So where landowners kind of sign over.
That's what I just put in the comments, like a land trust or land conservancy. Yeah.
Right. So they sort of sign away the right to do certain things on their land sort of in perpetuity. So you're not allowed to sell it to a developer, for example, to be able to cover it with hotels, but you can carry on using it as farmland as long as it's not too intensive and so on. So yeah, I mean, that seemed exactly like what Slovakia really could do with, but wasn't doing then. And I don't see much more happening yet, but there's a need for it.
Okay, thank you. And one last question from Tikomir.
Hello, I was just wondering, there was the graph that showed the bear population, and it kind of had the minimum at 1930. Would you say that the sort of the minimum of the wolf population was around the same time, or was the pattern of decline and then resurgence for wolves kind of different in terms of the timeline?
Wolves had a couple of low spots, yeah. So they had one, like roughly that time, but then they recovered quite a bit during and through the Second World War, and well, people were kind of distracted, killing each other instead of killing wildlife, to put it flippantly. But then once people got back to persecuting wolves again, then they sort of drove the numbers right down to another low point in the 60s and early 70s. And then since the first legal protections in 1975, the population has come up quite a bit. It's had more fluctuations since then due to hunting. So the hunting of wolves until recently was much more intensive than the hunting of bears, but not enough to drive them back down again. So yeah, so the last low point I would say was the early 70s for wolves.
All right, thank you, and thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
Yes. And I don't see any more questions. So I think we're going to say goodbye for this afternoon. It was a great presentation, very interesting, Robin. Thank you again. And
Yeah.
like, go ahead.
You're welcome. I hope it wasn't too long. I sort of realized it was longer than you
That's
planned.
okay. I think we have a very interested audience here.
Okay.
So I want to say goodbye to everyone. Thank you for coming, and have a great rest of the afternoon and the rest of the evening for you, Robin.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank
So,
you.
Thank you again from my side. Yeah. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.